What if I told you there's a brutal Dimir Control commander that completely shuts down aristocrat decks, wins the game by using rats, and you can build the entire list on a €100 budget? Vren the Relentless. For 4 mana we get a 3/4 red rogue with 3 abilities that when combined turn this into one of the most brutal control engines you can run in the command zone. Let's start with the basics. Vren has Ward 2, meaning when an opponent wants to target him with any spell or ability they will have to pay an additional 2 mana to do so. And while Ward doesn't sound all that flashy, it's my personal favorite part about Vren. Because he is such a value engine, people will just have to remove him at some point. And the Ward just makes sure it's always really inefficient for your opponents to do so. Because let's say your opponents are trying to target him with a Path to Exile, it will now cost them 3 mana to do so, absolutely ruining their tempo. His next ability states, if a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. And that single line of text just completely shuts down any sort of sacrifice decks, aristocrat loops, graveyard recursion, undying, persist, all of it. Their Blood Artist doesn't trigger, their Gravecrawler won't come back, and their Solemn Simulacrum won't even draw them a card anymore. And that ability alone already makes Vren into an absolute nightmare to play against. And creatures getting exiled is exactly what sets up his most powerful ability. At the beginning of each end step you will get to create X11 red tokens, X being the number of creatures that were exiled under your opponent's control this turn. And these reds will get +1/+1 for each other red you control, including Vren himself. So every time your opponents lose creatures, Vren will be watching. And not just on your turn, but at the beginning of every end step. If 2 opponents are swinging at each other and trading creatures in combat, you will get reds. If you're playing against an opponent that's constantly blinking their own creatures, you will get reds. If any sort of spot removal or board wipes are being played, you will get reds. You don't even have to be involved and destroy the creatures yourself. As long as creatures are leaving your opponent's boards for any reason, Vren will be building you an army in the background. And these aren't just normal red tokens. Each one grows for every other red you control, meaning you only need a couple of creatures to get removed to make your red army scale completely out of control. Now there are a couple of red tribal cards out there you could use for this deck, but honestly you don't really need them, since eventually once you have enough reds you will just take over the board with their raw stats. So instead of building this as some sort of a cute little red tribal deck, I decided to build Vren as a full Edict Control deck. We're gonna be setting up early value engines, resolving Vren, and then slowly tearing apart the table with really efficient spot removal, board wipes, and forced sacrifice effects. All while Vren will be converting every single creature dead into an army of scaling rats. This deck is very consistent at controlling the board and becoming the archenemy of the table out of nowhere. And the best part, this is a €100 budget list that doesn't run any game changers, any tutors, or any combos. Just pure brutal red based control for less of the price than a single booster box. As I do in all my videos, I will be going over every single card in the deck and explaining why I decided to include it. This video is divided up in 8 categories: the sacrifice effects, the mass interaction, the support, card draw, acceleration, protection and interaction, the lands, and in the end I have an upgrade section where I will be going over the cards you can include in the deck if you don't care about the €100 budget. And let's get started by talking about the engine of the deck, the sacrifice effects. These are the edict and forced sacrifice effects that allow us to tear apart our opponent's boards, all while Vren will convert every creature dead into an army of scaling rats. I'll start by going over the creature bodies that have an edict effect stapled onto them. We're running 8 of these creatures and at first glance they all look really similar. They all serve the same core purpose, and that is forcing opponents to sacrifice creatures. A Cursed Marauder, probably the most efficient edict creature around because it will only cost you 2 mana. Whenever it enters the battlefield, each player will have to sacrifice a non-token creature. And the non-token part on this card is actually really relevant. Because let's say you're playing against a Balin player, for example, who has like 7 gazillion rabbit tokens on the battlefield. When you do play your Accursed Marauder, you will be able to snipe away their Balin because they won't be able to sacrifice any tokens to its effect. Next up, we have 3 Edict creatures with exactly the same effect: a Flashback Marauder, a Demon's Disciple, and a Merciless Merciless Executioner. All are 3 mana bodies that whenever they enter the battlefield will make every player sacrifice a creature. While these cards don't have any extra fancy effects, these are exactly the type of cards we need for this type of Vren deck. And that is because whenever you do have Vren on the battlefield and you resolve any of these creatures, assuming all of your opponents have a creature to sacrifice, this will result in us getting 3 red tokens while also removing any threats our opponents might have on the table. And in this deck, depending on your opening hand, these creatures have multiple uses. Whenever you don't have any acceleration in your opening hand to get Vren out as early as turn 3, you can just play these creatures to just make your opponent sacrifice any of their early value creatures or their low cost commanders, because they won't be controlling any other creatures yet. And if your opponents don't control any threats on the board, you can just hold these edict creatures in your hand, wait until you can get your Vren out, and then just start playing them to generate you an absurd amount of reds while decimating your opponent's boards. And since these effects come attached to a creature body, it doesn't even matter that you yourself have to sacrifice a creature. You can just play your Flashback Marauder and sacrifice it to its own effect. Playcrafter, another 3 mana edict creature with an additional effect. When its ability resolves and your opponents aren't able to sacrifice a creature to it, they will have to discard a card. So even if you're playing against some sort of deck that barely plays any creatures, a Playcrafter will still generate you value. Gravelighter, a 3 mana flying body that whenever it enters the battlefield will draw you a card if another creature died this turn. And if no creatures died this turn, he will make every player sacrifice a creature. As you will see later in this video, we are playing an insane amount of cards that allow us to destroy creatures whenever we want to. Meaning that depending on what you need most at the current board state, you will be easily able to choose if you want Gravelighter to either draw you a card or just function as another edict creature. Really versatile card this one. Rankle, Master of Pranks. For 4 mana you get a flying haste body that whenever it deals combat damage to a player allows you to choose any number of its 3 options. The first option will make each player discard a card, which is a really oppressive effect that can totally cripple your opponents. The second option will make each player draw a card, which can be a really useful option to just refill your hand and dig for options. And the third option is an edict effect, making each player sacrifice a creature. And thanks to Rankle having haste, he will have an immediate impact from the turn he hits the board. You will always have at least one opponent that isn't able to block a flying creature, ensuring that you can get Rankle's triggers. And the best thing about Rankle is that it is a creature that stays on the battlefield, and every time you do connect with him, you get to repeat its effect over and over again, making your opponent sacrifice creatures, generating you 3 reds, and for your own sacrifice you can just use one of the red tokens you just generated on an earlier turn. Wasteland Raider, probably the least efficient edict creature in the deck because it does have a cost of 4 mana. But the reason why it's included is the fact that it has the squat mechanic, meaning whenever you cast this creature as an additional cost, you can pay 2 generic mana any amount of times. For each time you did pay the additional cost, you will get a copy of Wasteland Raider entering the battlefield. And in the late game, once you do have a ton of mana available, this card can get absolutely out of control. Because let's say you pay 8 mana for this creature, you will have 3 copies entering the battlefield, and each opponent will have to sacrifice 3 of their creatures, potentially generating you a total of 9 red tokens. Now let's get into the non-creature sacrifice effects. Innocent Blood, probably the simplest sacrifice card out there. For just 1 mana, every player has to sacrifice a creature. Now obviously the mana efficiency on this card is absolutely fantastic. The only downside being is that you can't play this card if you only control Vren, because you will have to sacrifice your own commander. But later in the game, once you do have a couple of red tokens on the battlefield, this card is some absolutely fantastic value. Liliana's Triumph. For 2 mana, on instant speed you get a one-sided edict effect, making each opponent sacrifice a creature. It also has an additional effect if we do control a Liliana Planeswalker, but sadly we don't play it in the deck. And the fact that this card can be played on instant speed is actually a really big deal in this deck. Because let's say you have Vren on the battlefield and on your first main phase you play a Flashback Marauder. making your opponent sacrifice 3 creatures, and then you want to go to your end step. If you are then playing against some really smart opponents, they can hold priority before you go to your end step, cast a removal spell and remove your Vren, and you won't actually be generating any reds, because Vren won't be around anymore in your end step to put his trigger on the stack. But by using instant speed removal, you can sort of bypass this effect, because when you have Vren on the battlefield, you can just leave your mana open, pass the turn to one of your opponents, and let's say for example they have an empty board and they just played their commander. They will then go to their end step, and no matter if any creatures died or not, Vren will always put his trigger on the stack. You can then play an instant speed sacrifice effect like Liliana's Triumph in response to your own Vren trigger, making your opponent sacrifice their commander, and even if your opponents respond to this and remove your Vren in the process, his trigger will stay on the stack, and you will always get to generate red tokens no matter what happens to your Vren. It's some really advanced Magic gameplay, but if you are playing in a pot with some really smart players, this is actually quite relevant. And this sort of knowledge will make a big difference between average Vren players and some really good Vren players. Extract a Confession, a 2-mana one-sided edict effect that also has the collect evidence mechanic, meaning as an additional cost to this spell you can exile cards from your graveyard with total mana value 6 or greater, and when you do, instead of your opponents just sacrificing any of their creatures, they will have to sacrifice the creature with the greatest amount of power they control. A really good option to just snipe your opponent's biggest threats off the board, and it gives all the cards we cast earlier in the game that are in our graveyard an actual use. Momentum Breaker, a 2-mana enchantment from the Aether Drift set that I didn't even know existed before making this video. Whenever it enters, each opponent will have to sacrifice either a creature or a vehicle they control, and if they can't, just like Playcrafter, they will have to discard a card. Now 90% of decks aren't even running vehicles, making this card just function as a one-sided edict effect. But if you do play against some opponents that are running some really efficient vehicles like a Shurikai, this card actually gives you a way to deal with them. Because when vehicles aren't crewed, they are actually really hard to deal with because they will just be artifacts instead of creatures. This card will also start your engines and you will be able to sacrifice it to gain some life, but that's not a reason why it's included, and it's not all that relevant of an ability. Sheoldred's Edict, 2-mana instant speed spell that will allow you to pick 1 out of 3 options. You can make each opponent sacrifice a non-token creature, which like I mentioned can be really good against some token decks to just snipe away their commander. You can make each opponent sacrifice a creature token, which I suppose in some really specific situations might help you deal with that huge Merit Lage token they have on the battlefield. Or you can make each opponent sacrifice a planeswalker. You can just pick the specific option you need most at the current specific board state. And like I already explained, the fact that you can play this card on instant speed just pushes it completely over the top. Tithing Blade, a 2-mana artifact that whenever it enters, as you could have guessed, makes each opponent sacrifice a creature. And this card also has the Craft with Creature ability. By paying 5 mana, exiling this artifact and either a creature you control or in your graveyard, you get to flip it to its backside, which is an artifact that at the beginning of your upkeep will gain you 1 life and make each opponent lose 1 life. A really efficient one-sided 2-mana edict effect that later in the game, when you do have a ton of mana to spare and no other place to make, can give you an additional late game benefit. Soul Shatter, for 3 mana on instant speed, each opponent will have to sacrifice a creature with the greatest amount of power they control, functioning in exactly the same way as an Extract a Confession with the additional cost being paid. It will just cost you 1 mana more, but you will be able to use it on instant speed. Vona's Hunger, probably one of the best sacrifice cards in the entire deck. Baseline, for just 3 mana you get an instant speed one-sided edict effect, but this card also has the Ascent mechanic, meaning if you do control 10 or more permanents, you will get an additional effect, and that is that each opponent will have to sacrifice half the amount of creatures they control rounded up. And as you can imagine, this type of effect for just 3 mana is just absolutely brutal. Let's say each of your opponents controls a total of 5 creatures on the board, and you are able to cast a spell with the Ascent mechanic active. Your opponents will then each have to sacrifice 3 creatures, resulting in a total of 9 creatures dying, which will generate you 9 scaling reds with Vren on the battlefield, and that for just 3 mana. And getting the Ascent mechanic active in this deck isn't really all that hard to do, because we will will be generating a huge amount of creature tokens ourselves. And the last card in this section is Will of the Abzan. For 4 mana, you get a card that allows you to choose one out of 2 options. The first option will make every opponent sacrifice a creature with the greatest amount of power they control, and they will all lose 3 life. And the second option is a reanimation effect, allowing you to just return any creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And the best part is that whenever you do have your commander on the battlefield, you actually get to pick both options. Now, we're not a reanimator deck by any means, but we can use this effect to get one of our edict creatures back onto the battlefield. So usually when you play this with Vren active, your opponents will have to sacrifice a creature to the effect of Will of the Abzan, then you can just reanimate your Flashback Marauder, and your opponents will have to sacrifice an additional creature, giving you a total of 6 sacrifices for just 4 mana. And later in the game, if your Vren got removed a couple of times, you can just make him go to your graveyard and reanimate him for 4 mana. A really nifty way to just bypass any of the commander attacks. Next up, we have the mass interaction, and this is where things get ugly for the table. Board wipes and other one-sided effects that allow us to clear multiple creatures at once, allowing us to fully control the board. And once you start clearing multiple creatures at once, you will get a huge amount of new recruits for your red army. 0 Point Ballot. Another card I didn't even know existed before making this video. For 1 black mana plus X, you get to destroy every creature on the board with a toughness of X or less. If you paid 6 or more mana for the value of X, you get to return 1 creature destroyed this way to the battlefield. And this card is one of the most versatile wipes in the entire deck, because you can just cast this for a total cost of 4 mana and you will destroy everything, but Vren will remain on the battlefield because he has 4 toughness, resulting in wiping most of the creatures off the board and generating you a huge amount of reds. And later in the game, if you invest a total of 7 mana into this spell, it will just wipe the entire board, even the biggest creatures, and even though your Vren will die in the process, you will get to return him to the battlefield. Then you can just end your turn, you will get your Vren trigger, the board will be cleared, and you will still have your commander and a huge army of reds around. You can start swinging at your opponents on your next turn. Curse of the Swine. For 2 blue mana plus X, you get to exile X target creatures. Then for each creature exiled this way, its controller will get to generate a 2/2 board token. And this card is just the perfect fit for our deck. You can cast it for 3, just exile 1 creature, or you can cast it for 5 and just pinpoint remove any problematic creatures on the battlefield. And the fact that your opponents will get creature tokens in return is actually a huge benefit to us, because whenever the boards get destroyed in combat or by any of our mass removal spells, we will get to generate red tokens of those, just double dipping on the value this spell generates us. Force of Despair. For 3 mana, you get to destroy all creatures that enter the battlefield this turn, and instead of paying its normal mana cost, you can also exile another black card from your hand to cast the spell for free. And this is one of my favorite cards in the entire deck, because once you're tapped out and your opponents think they can go for a really explosive turn, just dumping all creatures in their hand on the table or generating a huge amount of tokens, you can then just cast the spell for free, destroy all of them in the process, completely blowing your opponents out and generating a huge amount of red tokens of it. Every time I do play this spell, my opponents have to pick up the card from the table and read its effect, because they don't believe this is an actual card. Crippling Fear. Whenever you play this 4 mana card, you have to choose a creature type, and every creature that's not of the chosen type will get -3/-3 until the end of turn. Yeah, we're a red tribal deck, so this card just functions as a one-sided board wipe. Make an example. When you cast a spell, each opponent will have to divide the creatures they control into 2 separate piles. Then for each opponent, you get to select one of their piles and they have to sacrifice all the creatures in that pile. Now, in my experience, usually they will just put their one biggest value creature in a separate pile and then all the rest of their creatures. And you then get the option to just remove the biggest threat they have on the table, or get a huge amount of sacrifice effects, generating you a huge amount of reds in the process. Mandate of Abaddon. A spell that will make you choose a creature you control, and then it will destroy all creatures with less power than the selected creature. Now, depending on the board state, you can cast this on your Vren and destroy everything that has 2 power or less. A fantastic way to remove any mana dorks, Esper Sentinels or tokens from the battlefield. Or once you control like 10 reds for example, you can just cast this, all your reds will have equal power so they will survive the wipe and the rest of the board will just be cleared. Yahenni's Expertise. For 4 mana, all creatures will get -3/-3 until the end of turn. And -3 toughness is a magic number. Because Vren has a total toughness of 4 so you won't lose him in the process. And nowadays most people are playing some value commanders with really small creature bodies anyways. And the -3 toughness will be enough to just clear all of them. And just that effect in itself would already be more than enough reason to include this card in the deck. But on top of that, whenever this spell resolves, you get to cast any card in your hand with mana value 3 or less for free, making the value this card generates you just absolutely ridiculous. You can just wipe the board and then follow up with any of the other value pieces I will be talking about later in the video. Blight Grenade, a 5 mana spell that will allow you to destroy any creature on the battlefield, and then you will get to give all creatures -3/-3 until the end of turn. It does cost 1 mana more than all of the previous mentioned spells, but in return you both get to spot remove any huge creature body on the battlefield and then follow up with a wipe. Night Incarnate, a 5 mana creature that whenever it leaves the battlefield will give all creatures -3/-3 until the end of turn. Now aside from our Edict creatures, we don't have a reliable way to sacrifice this creature to trigger its effect. Good thing that this card has the evoke mechanic, meaning we can cast it for 4 mana and whenever it enters the battlefield we instantly have to sacrifice it, triggering its effect. So you can view this as another 4 mana board wipe, or in some situations you can actually hardcast it for 5 mana as a creature and on a later turn play any of your Edict creatures to sacrifice this card whenever you need to wipe. Season of Loss, a 5 mana card that whenever you play it will give you 5 paws to spend on any of its modes. For 1 paw you can make each player sacrifice a creature. For 2 paws you get to draw a card for each creature you control that died this turn. And for 3 paws each opponent will lose X life, X being the total number of creatures in your graveyard. And the best part about this card is the amount of versatility it brings, because you can just spend your paws as you like to make any combination of its effects happen depending on what you need most at the current board state. You can just pick the first mode 5 times and make every player sacrifice 5 creatures. You can pick the first option 3 times and then go for the second option. Everyone will have to sacrifice 3 creatures and you will be drawing 3 cards in the process. Or whenever you sacrifice any of your creatures through any other ways this turn, you can just pick the first mode once and the second mode twice, drawing you a huge amount of cards in the process. Swampyard Massacre. For 5 mana you will get to generate 2 1/1 squirrel tokens. Yeah, I know we are a red deck and not a squirrel deck, but these tokens are actually quite relevant for the second part of this card's ability. Then each creature on the board that isn't a rat, a spider, a squirrel or an insect will get -1/-1 until the end of turn for each rat, insect, spider or squirrel you control. So baseline, whenever you cast this card you will get to generate 2 squirrels and every other creature will get -2/-2 until the end of turn. But as you can imagine, thanks to Vren being a rat and him generating you a huge amount of rat tokens, usually you will be controlling like 5, 7, 10 rats whenever you cast this and it will be a one-sided board wipe. And the last and the most expensive card in this section is Necromantic Selection. For 7 mana you get to destroy all creatures and then return 1 creature destroyed this way to the battlefield. And just like I mentioned when I was talking about 0-point ballot, the fact that this card will destroy your own Vren is actually not that big of a deal. Because you just wipe anything on the board, return Vren to the battlefield, and you will still get its trigger at the end of your end step, generating you a huge amount of rats while your opponents have no creatures left. Next up we have the support section. These are the cards that didn't fit into any other category, but they really amplify what this deck is trying to do. They make our control plan a lot smoother, a lot more consistent, and they will make it easier for us to actually close out the game. Correction Reclamation, a 1 mana enchantment with an activated ability. By paying 2 mana and 2 life, we get to return target creature from our graveyard to our hand. And even though this deck isn't running any sort of infinite combos, you can set up some crazy value loops with this enchantment, because this card will enable you to just recur your Edict creatures over and over again, making sure you can just keep playing them, sacrifice them to their own effect, and then just return them again with Phyrexian Reclamation. Just tearing apart your opponent's boards in the late game and making them sacrifice creatures over and over again, and just feeding a huge amount of creature bodies to Vren to convert into scaling rats. And a card with a really similar effect is Chthonian Nightmare, a 2-mana enchantment that whenever it enters the battlefield will generate you 3 energy. And then by sacrificing a creature, returning this card to our hand, and paying X amount of energy, we get to return any creature with mana cost X or less from our graveyard to the battlefield. You can just play this card, sacrifice one of your rats, return this card to your hand, reanimate your Flashback Marauder, make each opponent sacrifice a creature, sacrifice your own Flashback Marauder to its effect. You will get to generate 3 new rats in the process, and then you can just keep repeating this loop for as long as you do have the mana and the rats available, making your opponents just sacrifice all of their creatures. And the fact that you do have to sacrifice your rat tokens doesn't really matter anyways, because in theory, every time you go through this loop and you get to your end step, Vren will generate you 3 new rat tokens for every time you looped it. Cover of Darkness, a 2-mana enchantment that when it enters the battlefield will make you choose a creature type. Obviously, we will be naming rat, and all creatures of the chosen type will get the fear mechanic, meaning they can be blocked except by artifact creatures or other black creatures. A really cost-efficient way to make your rats even harder to block, and that will make it easier for you to just close out the game. And another card that will make it easier to close out the game by giving your rats evasion is Piper of the Swarm, a 2-mana body that will give all of your rats menace. Like the previous card, already really solid, but on top of that it has 2 additional abilities. For 2 mana and tapping it, you get to generate a 1/1 rat token, which sadly doesn't scale with the amount of rats you control, but it will scale up all the rats that Vren generates you. And for 4 mana and sacrificing 3 rats, you get to gain control of any creature on the battlefield. And this effect isn't until the end of turn. You will get to gain control of that creature permanently, which can result in you stealing some of the most valuable creatures your opponents control, like in Italy, and just winning the game that way. Genesis Chamber, a 2-mana artifact that for as long as it is on the battlefield and a non-token creature enters, it will generate the controller of that creature a 1/1 mirror token. As you've seen by now, we do play a huge amount of cards that will wipe the board of small creatures. And playing cards like a Genesis Chamber is a fantastic way to give your opponents even more creatures on the board that we can start converting into scaling rat tokens. And even if you're playing against opponents that barely run any creatures themselves, just handing out our own tokens to our opponents will make sure we will always have bodies to convert into rats with Vren. Now that we're talking about giving out our own tokens, Tribute to Horobi. Whenever this card enters the battlefield, each opponent will get to generate a 1/1 rat token. If this card sticks around for another turn, it will just repeat this effect and hand out even more tokens. And when we get to the 3rd stage, we have to exile this card and it will return to the battlefield backside up, which is a flying haste 3/3 creature that whenever it enters the battlefield will give you control of all rats on the battlefield, including all the tokens the front side of this card generated you. And honestly, both giving your opponents rat tokens you can start removing, or just gaining control of them yourself and buffing up all your other rat tokens from Vren is just a win-win situation. And on top of that, whenever you do decide to attack with the creature part of this card, you get the option to sacrifice another creature. When you do, you get to draw a card. So for just 2 mana, you get additional targets to convert into rats with Vren, or you will get more rats under your control to just scale up your army, and it even acts as a card draw engine. Some excellent value on this card. Boggart Trawler, a 3-mana creature that whenever it enters the battlefield allows you to exile target player's graveyard. And since nowadays in modern day Magic most decks rely on using their graveyards, you should always include some sort of graveyard hate in your decks, because exiling someone's graveyard with the right timing might just win you the game. You can use this against any sort of spellslinger deck that's about to cast a Past in Flames and starts flashbacking spells from their graveyard. If you're playing against a land recursion deck like a Necrobloom, this card will just ruin their day, and obviously this just shuts down reanimator decks. And the best part about this card is that whenever you don't need this effect, you can just just play the backside, which is a land that taps for 1 black mana and even enters the battlefield untapped for the low cost of 3 life. There's really no reason why you shouldn't be playing any of these MDFC land cards in your decks. Final word Phantom, a 3 mana flying creature with the flash mechanic that will allow us during each opponent's end step to cast any card on instant speed. And this is in my opinion one of the most underrated cards in the entire Commander format, especially for any type of control deck, because this card just allows you to go for a draw and go playstyle. You don't have to cast anything anymore during your own turn, and you can just leave your lands untapped, which allows you to just have the mana open for any sort of counter spell or spot removal spell depending on what your opponents will do. It enables a really reactive playstyle, and like I already mentioned, all of our removal effects get way better when you are able to play them on instant speed. Because let's say you do have this creature and Vren on the battlefield, whenever an opponent is ending their turn, you will get a Vren trigger on the stack. You can then just flash in a Flashback Marauder, making that opponent sacrifice whatever creature they just played if they don't control any other creatures. And even if they are able to remove your Vren, the trigger will still be on the stack and you will be able to generate red tokens. Marrow Gnawer, and I really like to view this card as the red version of a Krenko, because it will generate you an exponential amount of red tokens. By tapping this creature and sacrificing a red, you get to generate X11 red tokens equal to the amount of reds you control, which as you can imagine will always be a huge amount thanks to the amount of red tokens that Vren will generate us. Sadly, the reds it generates us will only be 1/1 tokens, but they will buff up all of the red tokens so we are able to generate with Vren. And since usually whenever you activate this card you will be generating like 5, 10, 15 red tokens, the stat boost they will get is absolutely crazy. And on top of that, just like Cover of Darkness, whenever you have Marrow Gnawer on the field, all reds will have fear, making them nearly impossible to block for some specific decks, and you will easily be able to close out the game. If you're enjoying these in-depth Commander deck videos and you want to support me and the channel, check out the YouTube membership program. Members will get early access to the deck lists, access to some exclusive Discord chat rooms where I'm always sharing sneak peeks of what projects I'm currently working on, and at the highest tier you can even submit your deck for a personal review by me. This video also marks a fun little milestone. It's officially the first Dimir deck I created for the channel, which means I only have a mono white and a mono green commander left to have a deck available in every single possible color combination. Alright, that being mentioned, let's get back to the reds. Next up we have the card draw section. Since Vren doesn't have any card draw built into himself, we do need additional tools to make sure we never run out of gas. These cards will make sure our hand is never empty and that we can keep answering threats and keep feeding Vren with removal turn after turn. Call of the Ring, a 2 mana enchantment that at the beginning of our upkeep will give us a ring tempt. And whenever we choose a creature as our ring bearer, we get to draw a card and lose 2 life. A perfect card to just play on turn 2 before Vren even resolves, and later in the game it will just give us a consistent source of card draw. The ring tempt mechanic isn't really all that relevant for us in this deck. I suppose it can give you some free card looting which can be nice over the course of the game, but that's not a reason why this card is included. Idol of Oblivion, a classic 2 mana artifact that is being played in almost any sort of token deck. And that is because you can tap it to draw a card, but you can only activate this ability if you generated a token this turn. Yeah, whenever Vren is online we will be generating tokens every turn, and this is just another 2 mana source of really consistent card draw. Waterbender Ascension, a 2 mana enchantment that whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to an opponent will get a quest counter. Then if this enchantment has 4 or more quest counters on it, you get to draw a card. Now there are a ton of really similar coastal piracy card effects like this one that will draw you a card whenever you connect with a creature, but usually they will come at the cost of 4 mana. With this card you have the benefit that you can just drop it really early into the game, and eventually on later turns you will easily be able to get this card's effect online, because at some point you will just have this many reds on the battlefield that you will always be able to connect with a huge amount of creatures. And since this card doesn't state 1 or more creatures, you will will actually get to draw a card for each creature that connects. So if you swing with 5 reds and 3 of them do connect, you will get 3 cards, generating you a huge amount of card advantage for as long as this card stays on the battlefield. And it also has the Waterbend 4 mechanic, meaning you can pay 4 generic mana to make any of your creatures unblockable until the end of turn, and you can also tap any artifact or creature to help pay for the waterbending cost. Now I'm gonna be honest, I have never ever used the waterbending mechanic on this card, because in this type of deck you will have a huge amount of reds and you will always be able to get combat damage through. But I suppose if you are playing against a player with more tokens than you control, you can just start making your reds unblockable to actually get damage through and take them out of the game. Braids, Arisen Nightmare, a 3-mana creature that at the beginning of your end step will allow you to sacrifice either a land, an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, or a planeswalker. When you do, each opponent will get the option to sacrifice a permanent of a similar type. And when they don't, they get to lose 2 life and we get to draw a card. And the amount of value that Braids will generate you is just absolutely insane, because you can just start sacrificing your red tokens and you will either get an additional sacrifice from your opponents generating you even more reds, or when your opponents choose not to sacrifice, she will draw you a huge amount of cards. It's a win-win situation. No matter what your opponents choose, you will always get a huge amount of value from Braids. Correction Arena, a classic 3-mana card that at the beginning of your upkeep will lose you 1 life and draw you an additional card. Consistent, reliable, and will generate you more and more value the longer the game goes on. And a newer card that barely any people are playing that is in my opinion the straight up power crept version of a Correction Arena is Unholy Annex. It's one of the room cards from the Duskmourn set, meaning whenever this card is in your hand you can choose to either cast the left side or the right side of this card. And then whenever this is on the battlefield on a later turn you can choose to pay the mana cost of the part you didn't cast to actually get its effect active. Now the main reason this card is included in the deck is the left side of this card, which at the beginning of your end step will draw you a card at the cost of 2 life. And the reason that I mentioned that this card is better than a Correction Arena is that you will get the card available to you at your end step, not the beginning of your next upkeep. So you can just resolve this effect, you will instantly get to draw a new card that's available at your end step, and if this is some sort of a counter spell like a negate, you will instantly be able to use it during that turn cycle. And when you compare this card with a Correction Arena, you won't even have the negate in your hand until your next turn. And the right side of this card will generate you a 6/6 flying demon with flying. Honestly not really that relevant, but I suppose later in the game when you do have a ton of mana to spare, you can get a big flying creature body on the board. It's always nice to just have additional options. Bident of Tassa, a 4-mana legendary artifact that just like an active Waterbender's Ascension will draw you a card whenever any of your creatures connect to an opponent. A really solid card draw engine, and it has an additional activated ability, which will make all creatures your opponents control attack this turn if they are able to do so. And this effect is actually quite relevant in this deck, because you can force your opponents to either attack into each other or into your huge army of reds, which will then result in creatures dying in combat and us being able to generate even more red tokens with Vren. Enduring Curiosity, a 4-mana enchantment creature with exactly the same effect as the previous card. Whenever a creature connects, you will get to draw a card. And all of the cards from the Enduring Duskmourn cycle have the same effect. Whenever this creature would die, it just returns to the battlefield as an enchantment with its effect still active. So your opponents will have to use 2 removal spells to permanently get rid of this creature, and you can even use it as some sacrifice fodder for your own edict effects like an Innocent Blood, and its effect will just remain active anyways. Distant Melody. For 4 mana on sorcery speed, you will get to draw 1 card for each creature you control of a specific type. And I'm still not sure if this card should be included in the deck, because let's say later in the game you do control 10 reds and you resolve this spell. It will draw you a massive 10 cards, but that being said, when you do have the 10 reds on the battlefield, you are already really ahead, and usually you won't need the 10 cards to win the game anymore. What I'm trying to say is that this card sometimes feels like some sort of a win more card. In some situations it will just be a dead card in your hand doing nothing because you don't have any reds, and usually when you are ahead later in the game you don't really need its effect. On paper the effect looks really good, so I decided to keep this card in the deck, but during playing something just feels off about this card. I'm not quite sure what. Next up we have the acceleration section. We're not playing that many fancy acceleration spells, so I will be going over this section rather quickly. Sol Ring. Yeah, obviously it's included. It is one of the most efficient cards ever printed. And this card does a couple of things. First up, if you do have a Sol Ring Vren in your opening hand, you will be able to resolve Vren as early as turn 2. And I can guarantee you whenever you do so, the game is basically just over. Because you can then instantly follow up with some edict effects and start generating you a huge amount of reds before your opponents are ever ready. It's also a really great tool to just rush out any of the expensive cards we're playing in this deck way earlier than we should. And if your opponents do manage to remove Vren even by going through his War 2, it's a perfect little artifact that will help you pay for his commander tax. And we're also playing 6 2-mana mana rocks in this deck. An Arcane Signet, a Dimir Signet, a Felwag Stone, a Mind Stone, a Talisman of Dominance, and a Solar Transformer. And with Vren you have two options. You can either choose to rush him out as early as turn 3 by using any of these mana rocks, just getting him online while your opponents are still setting up before they have any answers ready, or you can choose to just wait on casting Vren if your opponents are playing a ton of interaction, so you can cast him for 4 mana and you still have the mana available to protect him with some sort of counter spell. And these simple mana rocks are just really consistent ways to make sure you can do either of both options. Next up we have the protection and the interaction. Once Vren is online, we only have to do one thing, and that is to keep him on the board for as long as possible. The cards in this section will give us all the tools we need to protect Vren and to make sure we have ways to disrupt our opponent's game plans. An offer you can't refuse. For 1 mana you will get to counter any target non-creature spell, but in return the controller of that spell will get to generate 2 treasure tokens. Since we are playing this many sacrifice effects in this deck, we don't really need counter spells to deal with creatures. The only threats our opponents can throw at us are board wipes or spot removal. And this card giving us the ability to just stop any of that from happening for just 1 mana is a really fantastic deal. If your opponents are about to remove Vren or wipe your board, or they are trying to win the game by using any sort of non-creature combo, stopping that and just giving them 2 measly treasure tokens in return will always be worth it. Into the Floodmaw, a 1 mana instant speed spell that will allow you to bounce target creature an opponent controls. And this card also has the gift mechanic, meaning whenever you cast it, you do have the option to give an opponent a 1/1 fish token, and when you do so, instead of just bouncing a creature, you get to pick any non-land permanent instead, which will make sure you can use this effect to deal with any enchantment, planeswalker, artifact, whatever, and giving your opponents a 1/1 fish token is actually a benefit to us, because we can just remove it later and Vren will convert it into a red token. Not that after all. A 1 mana instant speed spell that will give target creature an additional line of text until the end of turn. And that is, when this creature would die, we get to return it to the battlefield with a Withdrawal token attached to it, which is basically a simple enchantment that will give it +1/+1 and make each opponent lose 1 life when it leaves the battlefield. A really solid effect to just make sure your Vren can get removed and sticks to the battlefield, and a card like this is actually really good to cast whenever your opponents or you yourself are playing a board wipe that would also destroy Vren. Because every creature on the board will die, Vren will then return, and at the beginning of your end step you will then get to generate a red token for each creature your opponents control that died to the wipe. Pongify and Rapid Hybridization. Both cards have different names, but they have essentially the same effect. For 1 blue mana, on instant speed, we get to destroy any target creature. The controller of that creature will then get to create a 3/3 creature token under their control. Now by themselves, these cards are already some really fantastic value. Just being able to remove any creature for 1 mana on instant speed is really efficient. But in this deck, since they will also generate tokens for our opponents, they get even better, because we will be able to make our opponents sacrifice those tokens and turn them into even more reds, making these 2 top tier cards even more valuable. Counter spell. For 2 blue mana, you get to counter any spell. It's cheap, it's reliable, and to this day it is still the golden standard for any sort of counter magic. Infernal Grasp. For 2 mana and 2 life, you get to destroy any creature on the board. And just like counter spell, cheap, reliable, and really efficient. The more cards we have in this deck that allow us to destroy our opponent's creatures, the more we'll slow them down and the more time we'll buy ourselves to actually take over the game with our reds. Feed the Swarm, a card that either allows us to destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls, and we will lose life equal to the mana value of the destroyed permanent. Now, since we are a Dimir deck, we don't really have that many options to deal with any problematic enchantments like an Aura Shards, a Rhystic Study, a Smothering Tide, but thanks to this little simple 2 mana card, we do have a way to deal with them. Negate. For 2 mana, you get to counter any non-creature spell. And like I already mentioned, the biggest threats our opponents can throw at us are non-creature spells, because we have more than enough ways to deal with any of their creatures. While Negate might seem like some sort of a budget card, it's a card that I sometimes even include in my budgetless decks. It's just a really efficient card. Reality Shift. For 2 mana we get to exile target creature, and its controller gets to manifest the top card of their library, meaning we get another exile based instant removal spell for 2 mana that will generate our opponents a token body we can remove later and turn into a rat. And the last and probably one of the most efficient cards ever printed is Dismember. For 2 Phyrexian black mana and 1 generic mana we get to give target creature -5/-5 on instant speed. And the Phyrexian mana basically means you can pay either a black mana for this or the cost of 2 life. Yeah, it's just some really efficient removal. For 1 generic mana you basically get to pinpoint remove any creature on the battlefield, and it even goes through indestructibility effects. Next up we have the lands, and even though it is a budget deck and the mana base isn't anything fancy, we are running a couple of utility lands, so I'll start by going over those. Bojuka Bog, a land that whenever it enters a battlefield, just like a Bogger Trawler, will exile target player's graveyard. The perfect ability attached to a land to deal with any sort of land recursion, reanimation, or spellslinger decks and just completely shut them out of the game. Forbidden Orchard, a land that will tap for any color, and whenever you tap it, you get to generate a 1/1 spirit token under target opponent's control. And this land can get absolutely crazy whenever you are able to play it as early as turn 1, because you can just be handing out these spirit tokens, and by the time you do have Vren on the battlefield, it will give you additional targets to convert into scaling rats. Probably one of the best cards in the entire deck. Swarmyard, a land that you can tap to regenerate either target spider, squirrel, insect, and most importantly, rat. This simple land will give you a way to protect Vren from being removed, free of any cost, and you will be able to use it again turn after turn whenever you untap this land. And for the regular mana producing lands we play a Reveal land, a Command Tower, a Filter land, a Check land, a Cycle land, a Tango land, a Tainted Isle, a Scryland, a Painland, and for basics we're playing 14 swamps and 8 islands. And last up we have the upgrade section. While this Vren deck already performs really well on a 100 euro budget, in this section I will be showing you the upgrades I'd make if you want to push this deck even further. At the end of this section I will also be flashing into the screen what cards you can swap out for these upgrades. 3/3 City. Whenever this land enters the battlefield you have to choose a creature type, and then for 2 mana and tapping this land you get to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool equal to the amount of creatures of the chosen type you control. Yeah, we're running a rat deck, we will always be controlling a huge army of rats, and this land will just generate you an insane amount of mana. Malakir Rebirth, a card that has exactly the same ability as a Not Dead After All. For 1 mana on instant speed and paying 2 life, you get to give target creature the ability that whenever it would get destroyed this turn, it just returns to the battlefield tapped. A perfect way to protect your Vren from any sort of spot removal or board wipe, and this card also has the benefit that whenever you don't need the effect you can just play the backside, which is a land you can tap for mana. It would obviously make for a really great inclusion in the deck, but since the effect on this card is this potent, the price tag is really high and I just couldn't fit it into the budget. Swansong. For 1 mana we get to counter either target enchantment, instant or sorcery spell, but in return the controller of that spell will get to generate a 2/2 bird token. Now in most decks this is already a really good counter spell, just allowing you to counter anything for 1 mana and giving a little token in return. Like I already mentioned, the fact that this card will generate a token for our opponents that we can convert into a rat later makes this really efficient card even better in this deck. Jet Medallion. 2 mana artifact that will reduce the cost of any black spell you cast by 1 generic mana. And since most cards in this deck do have a black mana pip in their cost, this cost reduction will apply to about like 80% of the cards in this deck. If you compare this to a 2 mana mana rock which can be tapped for 1 mana once a turn, once you do start casting multiple black spells in a single turn, a medallion will actually give you more value. Mana Drain, a card that's just a straight upgrade over a classic counter spell. For 2 mana it will just counter any spell, and at the beginning of your next main phase you get to add colorless mana to your mana pool equal to the cost of the countered spell. Now a classic counter spell is already some really solid value, but the additional effect that Mana Drain has can just set up for some game ending scenarios. You will be able to generate a huge amount of mana on your next turn, which you can use to just dump your entire hand on the table and just take over the game. Attrition, a 3 mana enchantment with an activated ability. For 1 black mana and sacrificing a creature you get to destroy target non-black creature. This card is just some sort of a removal Gatling gun that uses our red tokens as ammo. Once you do have a couple of reds on the board, this card will create some sort of a soft lock on your opponents. Because whenever they play a new creature, you just pay 1 mana, remove that creature, and the Vren trigger will generate you a new red token in the process at the end of the turn, enabling you to just remove any threat over and over again, and your opponents won't ever be able to make any creature they control stick to the board. Black Market Connections. This 3 mana enchantment will at the beginning of your first main phase allow you to choose any of its 3 options. You can pay 1 life to generate a treasure token, just accelerating your mana. You can pay 2 life to draw a card, acting as a really consistent card draw engine, or you can pay 3 life to generate a 3/2 changeling token, which will also be a red and scale up any of the red tokens you are able to generate with Vren. And the best part about this card is the fact that you can pick all 3 options at once. Acceleration, card draw, and a board-wide buff. Life is a resource anyways, people. Use it. Fierce Guardianship. For 3 mana, you get to counter any non-creature spell. But whenever you do control your commander, you can cast a spell without paying its mana cost. So you can just step out, cast your Vren, and even though you don't have any mana available, you still do have a way to protect him. In my opinion, all the cards that cost 0 mana whenever you do control your commander are absolutely broken and should be banned in the format. That being said, this card is just way too good not to include in the deck. Rhystic Study. Do you pay the 1? Yeah, it's a classic enchantment every commander player knows. Whenever an opponent casts any spell, they get the option to pay 1 generic mana. When they don't, you get to draw a card. Now, even though I personally don't really like this card at all, the fact that it is one of the best card draw engines in the entire format is just undeniable. It will just ensure that you never ever run out of cards. So if you do really want to push this deck to its absolute limit, you will have to get a copy of Rhystic Study. Toxic Deluge, a 3 mana spell that will allow you to pay X amount of life as an additional cost. And then each creature on the board will get -X, X being the amount of life you paid. And I don't think there are any other more efficient board wipes in existence. Depending on the board state, you can cast this card for a low cost of 2 life and just wipe the entire board if it only has low cost creatures and tokens on the battlefield. Or if you're playing against a dragon player, for example, who controls like 10 toughness creatures, you can just invest a huge amount of life and you still get to wipe the board. And since it is a -X effect, it even goes through indestructibility. In the commander format, you do start with 40 life, so you do have a ton of resource to work with to use on a Toxic Deluge. Deadly Rollick, another spell we can cast for free if we control our commander that will exile target creature. Yeah, there's no point in not running this card in the deck, because you can just pick any sort of spot removal spell we do run in our main board, and there isn't a single one that's more efficient as a 0 mana spell that will exile anything. Tombstone Stairwell. The last time I mentioned this card was in my Sephiroth video and people went absolutely crazy over it. It's a 4 mana enchantment with the cumulative upkeep mechanic, meaning at the beginning of your upkeep this card will get an age counter, and then you do have to pay the cumulative upkeep cost of this card for each age counter it has on itself. And the effect this card has is just absolutely busted. At the beginning of each upkeep, each opponent will get to generate X 2/2 tokens, X being the amount of creatures in their graveyard. And at the end of each turn, all of those tokens will get sacrificed. And yeah, you heard me right. That's each upkeep, each player, each end step. So just imagine having Vren on the battlefield and then playing this enchantment. And let's say each player has 3 creatures in their graveyard. You pass the turn to opponent 1, and everyone will get to generate 3 2/2 tokens. They then end their turn and all tokens will get sacrificed, which will result in you generating 9 reds thanks to Vren. Then we go to the next opponent's turn, go through the same process, we will get another 9 red tokens, opponent 3, same process, and we will end up with a total of 21 red tokens when it's our turn again, which all will have 22 power and 22 toughness. And that's just giving an example with only 3 creature cards in everyone's graveyard and just 1 turn cycle. The amount of value this card will generate you is absolutely ridiculous. And just imagine you paying the cumulative upkeep cost a couple of times and this actually stays on the battlefield for multiple turn cycles. It really is a 4 mana card that will just win you the game on the spot when you do have Vren on the battlefield. Kindred Dominance, a 5 mana enchantment that whenever a red enters the battlefield or it attacks will draw you a card. And if you just compare this card to like a Bident of Tessa, for example, you can see the value is just ridiculous. ridiculous. Because it will draw you cards whenever you just create a red token, which per turn cycle can be like 10 to 20 reds, and whenever you swing with any of your red tokens, they don't even have to connect. Per attacking red, you will get to draw a card. The value on this card is just absolutely bananas. And if this card can stick to the battlefield for just like one turn cycle, it can potentially draw you up to like 50 cards or something. And the last card in this section is Kindred Discovery. For 7 mana, you get to destroy all creatures except for the creature type you chose. And if we compare this card to the other 7 mana card we're playing in the deck, Necromantic Selection, it's just a straight upgrade. Because you just get to wipe the entire board, setting your opponents back to the Stone Age, and Vren and any of his red tokens won't even be affected by this. And that's it for my in-depth take on Vren the Relentless. An absolutely brutal control commander that doesn't just stop your opponents from playing Magic. It actively turns their creatures into your win condition. Instead of using any flashy combos or infinite loops, this deck wins by doing the most honest thing in Magic. Removing creatures, controlling the board, and building a huge red army while everyone else is just trying to survive. It's really interactive, really strong, a huge amount of fun to play, and on just a 100 euro budget, it is way stronger than it has any right to be. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, let me know by dropping a red emoji in the comments below. And of course, share this video with your entire local game store, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon so you don't miss next week's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.